See, I'm not as old as I thought. And he has been a teacher ever since. And as you probably have noticed, me, the ennobling effect of being a high school teacher, you had that.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Well, that they buy, see. And I've got to be great friends with him over the last 8 years, I suppose, because he, having been uplifted by his experience as a high school teacher, has decided that the students at the BBC are all the better for knowing a bit about the early history of our country. You have spoken of this to me before. And for the last 8 years, he's been bringing a busload of them out to Mount Tyson, where Mr. Finley and I could see them. But he also wanted to give them an idea of what the country was like when it was first opened up. Because my father was, and my grandfather had taken up land when it was opened up from Jimmy Tyson's area. And, my father was the first teacher in the first school and built there. I was the first kids in the first church that was ever built there. And moreover, I think you said, I look more like a very ancient citizen. I would tell them a bit about what happened in those days. As you all know, as well as I do, those days are worth recounting and worth remembering, because they were the finest lot of people that ever worked in those small farms, on working their own properties in their own name. They would have wondered. And I've done it every year. And you seem to have been satisfied, because you came and asked me every 3 and to my great sorrow, he's leaving school, our streets, and he won't be there again. Is that right?
Well, I'm leaving BBC, but I don't intend to leave school now.
Oh, I see. Well, I hope you come in. We'd be terribly pleased to see you. What wouldn't we? Anyway, this is an example of what I consider one of the noblest professions of the lot, a secondary school schoolmaster. And Garnet Hills, here you are. Yeah.
Thank you indeed, Sir Alan, for that welcome. I was thinking tonight as I sat here, enjoying my meal, it was a privilege to be amongst you. The last time that I can recall, I've very rarely spoken in a situation like this, but I can honestly say I was thanking you and Janky for this pleasure of being with you. Because years ago as a young schoolmaster, I took the first 11 from Newton College in Sydney, first cricket team, to Wesley College in Melbourne. It was a social occasion as well as being a sporting occasion, and we were duly welcomed at a dinner which the parents of the boys in the team, their parents gave this dinner. At this dinner, as the representative, the only representative from Newington College and being in charge, I was required to respond to the welcome which was given by Dr. Tom Cates. Dr. Tom Cates, or the Reverend Dr. Tom Cates, was the headmaster of Wesley College. Sitting beside me at the dinner was their coach of the first 11, P.L. Williams, a man who was a legend in his own time. We talk about men in the private school system of years ago. He was a legend. But P.L. was a very kindly man. He watched me during the dinner, hardly eating anything. I can assure you I enjoyed my meals tonight. But I was rather anxious about what I had to say. He led across and said, you know, there's nothing like speech making to spoil a good dinner. I said, no, that's quite right. And so when Dr. Cates finished and I was required to speak, I jumped to my feet, and almost the first thing I blurted out was, well, Mr. Williams assures me there's nothing like speeches to spoil a good meal at this stage. And Dr. Cates, of course, had just sat down after speaking for probably about 10 minutes, and there was a groan and an anguished groan from beside me. And he said, no. I said, whoops, what have I said? I broke the ice, and I was so relaxed, and the group there was so responsive that I had no further trouble. I did apologise to P.O. Williams and explain later, but I completely misunderstood him. But it's good to be here, not be harassed by, as I say, as Ian, particularly Ian and Clive Janky, have known what it's like, and Sir Alan, particularly in Mount Tyson, where I've been surrounded by 50 or 60 year 12s. I may get a chance to explain to you why we do have problems with year 12 now than we used to 30 to 40 years ago. But as Ian was very much aware, I always seemed to be anxious and very concerned that they were listening to what he had to say. And we used to endeavour to do this. I think we didn't altogether succeed, did we? Some of them, never could be interested in what was going on. More about that later. But to be free of those boys and be with you is a privilege. I think on another occasion, we're talking about being harassed. Years ago, I had to take a group of schoolboys. They were boarders from Toowoomba Grammar. At that stage, we had about 160. On Saturday night, they were allowed to go to the pictures. This was about 40 years ago. I mean, you'd imagine taking that number anywhere. These days, you wouldn't dare venture out on the streets. But they all duly walked down to the Empire Theatre. I had the responsibility of checking on the numbers when they arrived and assuring Bob Dodds, who was the manager of the Empire Theatre at that time, that we had 160 boys and then paying for them by cheque. I took a long time to work out the numbers as they came in dribs and drabs. Just at that moment, a very up-and-coming and aspiring young reporter from the Toowoomba Chronicle, Doug Rose, came up and greeted me very pleasantly and stood around when he watched my anguish at trying to get these boys to at least come and say who was there. The following Saturday, I was reported in the Toowoomba Chronicle in Doug's column as being the most harassed man of the week. I can assure you to be away from boys under this situation is a delight. I've actually made a list of the things I'd like to talk to you about because I know it's dangerous to get from my feet in a situation like this. When you start looking back over a long period, and it's 43 years of teaching, that there are so many incidents that come to mind that I could probably ramble on in a disconnected sort of a way. So I've endeavoured to keep a list of some of the things. I'll probably have to cut it very short. Ultimately, just let me know, or Lindsay. But it's great to be amongst friends. I didn't expect to, for example, I knew I was going to meet Lindsay and Sir Alan, and after all, Sir Alan's friendship goes back to the days when he was the driving force amongst the Scots old boys. He and his friend Andy Muir used to appear at Scots College when I first taught there. When they appeared, things started to hum. And likewise, of course, to be here with Lindsay. My first encounter with Lindsay was on a particular occasion when Toowoomba played Warwick cricket. And Lindsay was playing for Toowoomba and I was playing for Warwick. And this very up-and-coming young right-hand batsman, I thought he was a left-hander, but he assures me he's a right-hander. I can never recall whether I had the pleasure of bowling him out. But on that particular occasion, Warwick beat Toowoomba, and which was like David taking on Goliath. I remember it reported in the Warwick Daily News that on the following Monday, Toowoomba trounced. Actually, I think we won by about 2 wickets. We just scraped in against Toowoomba on that occasion. I hope you haven't remembered anything of the kind.
I'm saying you.
No. Because Toowoomba did have some very well-known cricketers at that stage. So our contact goes back also a long time. And then we've got, over the last 10 years, I've come to know Ian and Clive Janke so well and respected them so much for the sort of business they run and how active they're involved in the life at Mount Tyson and the whole district. So much so that when he asked me was I prepared to speak, my first reaction was, oh no, what use would I be? I remember making that comment. He said, you can say whatever you like. Right. Now that may seem a very pleasant experience to be able to talk about whatever you want to talk about, but I must admit it's a trap into which one can fall. And he asked me what was I going to call this address. I don't know if he's mentioned it to you what I'm supposed to be talking about, but I thought of this terminology of a schoolmaster's anecdotage. I looked it up in the dictionary. I'd heard this word, anecdotage. I knew what that's for, but I don't know what an anecdote was. But an anecdotage, and apparently it's a period in one's life when, to take the definition as it is, in a stage in life when conversation tends to be dominated by trivia. So probably it best describes what I will probably be guilty of doing this evening. Although in conclusion, I am intentional, if I have the time, to be more serious. But I said initially I'm delighted to be here, to be amongst friends, but I'm also delighted to be on the Darling Downs because to me this And I've heard Sir Alan say the same thing. It's the brightest bit of Australia there is. I mean, I've lived and taught in Sydney, Adelaide, Bathurst in New South Wales, and of course the last 23 years in Brisbane. But I still regard the Darling Downs to be my home. It's a long time since I've lived here, but it's still home to me. And when I come up over the range, it's a different feeling. And just to walk out on that golf course tonight and look out that way towards that area west does something to me. But I think of my father, you know, he was born in Toowoomba. My grandmother was born in Toowoomba in the 1860s when Toowoomba was just a village. Now, my father stayed on. In his youth, he played cricket and tennis for Toowoomba, representing Toowoomba in both sports. And like my mother was born in Inglewood. Now, still a little village that hasn't grown. In fact, it may have dropped off in size to a considerable extent. But and she went to school in Warwick. I remember she was sent, I must tell you this one, she was sent to a little school called Milton College in Warwick before World War I. Now, it closed down for financial reasons. This tended to happen quite often with small schools that were established by individual teachers. She then went to the convent, the Assumption Convent in Warwick for a number of years. And my mother was a very fine musician. And we all attributed that to the very fine schooling in music that she had from the nuns at the convent in Warwick. But one of the things that she was noted for, that she was quite a rabid Protestant, and she was allowed to round up all the Protestant girls in the convent, and every Sunday morning she marched them off down to St Mark's Anglican Church in the city of Warwick, and never missed out. Those girls never had a chance of missing church if my mother had anything to do with it. But my grandfather, for example, he was born in Inglewood. I must tell you the story about him. It's delightful. He was sent to Brisbane Grammar as a boarder in 1885. And he was a sport young brat. He'd injured himself. He'd been thrown from a horse when he was very young and had injured himself. They said he had one leg shorter than the other. He'd always been babied and rather allowed to do more or less what he wanted to. So when he went down to Brisbane Grammar as a boarder, he took with him his horse. He lasted the first 3 weeks and decided he had enough. So he rode his horse home through Spicer's Gap to Inglewood. It took him 5 days at the age of 13. He stayed at home for 6 weeks. They decided he better return to finish his schooling, at least have another go, so back he went. The mistake they made was they sent his horse with him. He did exactly the same thing. He lasted 1 week at Brisbane Grammar the following occasion, and that was it, the end of his formal schooling. But probably the one that I am most proud of is my association with Darling Downs is probably the original German settler on the Darling Downs, Fred Bracker. Fred Bracker came to the Downs. He came to Rosenthal outside Warwick. He was the first manager of Rosenthal in 1841. He followed the Leslies. He brought up his stud sheep, which he had brought out to Australia in 1829 from Silesia. And then he brought these up and worked for this pastoral company that ran the Rosenthal station. He brought his stud sheep with him. And then he also apparently started the stud at Glengullen. You know, Glengullen over there or towards Warwick. But it was quite an undertaking, that place as well. But Fred, it was my great-great-grandfather, and of course I am very fond of my attachment to the Downs when it goes back to 1841. Myself, you may well ask, why am I here after all these years of teaching? I mean, I was born and I was schooled at Toowoomba. I looked around, I could see some old school friends. If I may say, I remember Arthur Applegarth had been in my sister's class at school, and my sister thought a young fellow by the name of Arthur was a very nice young lad.
And he hasn't changed.
No, he hasn't. And of course, I look around and I see Ron. I mean, after all these years, and we used to play tennis. I thought, I've seen Ron Langton before. He said, yes, I know you too. Going back to the nearly 50 years. And starting to feel one's age, there's no doubt about this. But you may well wonder, why did I take up teaching? And I've examined this one. With Arthur here, he might appreciate this one particularly, any old Toowoomba grammar boys. In the years I was at school, And I was there for quite a long time. I'm somewhat unique. I attended school for 5 years. I had 3 months off of my junior year, and I had to repeat the junior because I'd missed so much school because of an injury. And then 5 years schooling, then I left, went back to school the following year, joined the Air Force, had 18 months and did my training as a pilot. Then I came back to school again in 1945 and spent another 3 months at Toowoomba Grammar along with an old friend, Rod Trowersdorf, man who's still in business in Toowoomba. And it was quite an experience, quite unique. So I've had contact with Toowoomba Grammar over many years, and I taught there at a later period. But I asked, why did I take up teaching? And I think if any of you have met, and some of you have, and know the reputation of H.E. Roberts, old Harry Roberts, Poob, as he was affectionately known as, he had a great affection or interest in Gilbert and Sullivan operas. And Toowoomba was one of the characters, I think, to which he was likened. And Poob was his nickname. To a certain extent, he was known as Harry, known as Boss. Arthur could correct me on that one, but that man, I think, probably in the days before television, when we didn't have role models on television, and so many of our kids, the boys that we teach, are no longer modelling themselves on what may be the central point of an experience for 3 or 4 years when they're at school. Some of their teachers, they model themselves on their television idols. H.E. Roberts, I think, a man who was tremendously interested in cricket, tremendously interested in sport, was a wonderful scholar, loved teaching Latin. I was never any good at Latin, but nevertheless, I had a tremendous regard for him. I've never forgotten the occasion when he used to come down and have practice with the first 11. And he always enjoyed playing with the second 11. He captained the second 11 in the local competition. We used to practice with the first. On this particular day, I was a very wild and erratic bowler. And unfortunately, I hit him in a very tender spot. He didn't have a box on an occasion. He was rolling in agony on the turf wicket. None of us knew what to do. With the headmaster just lying up the bag there, didn't know where to pick him up by the feet, which was the back of the stock remedy for that, or hold him up upside down. And thereafter, Harry used to say, "Oh, Hills, would you give your ball to somebody else?" But a man that I had tremendous admiration for. And I remember him sitting beside me on one occasion and saying, "I'm sort of taking up teaching." I said, "No." He said, "They keep you young. They keep you young, old chap." That was a typical expression that he used. And I really believe that probably that's why I drifted, in one sense, into teaching. I didn't know what I wanted to do after I finished at university. In fact, I didn't finish. My first 2 or 3 years, I did cricket 1 and cricket 2, I think it was, and tennis 1 and tennis 2. And when I left, I wasn't equipped to teach anything. I mean, I had done 7 or 8 units of a degree. I had no formal training, yet we were taken on as teachers. And this was fairly typical, but there was no formal training for most people in those days. And of course, when I appeared in the first class, first morning at Scots College Warwick, I remember I took this job on because the Reverend Norman Joplin, who later was headmaster for a brief period at St Clair Home, said to me, "Why don't you apply for a job at Scots?" He said, "They're looking for new teachers up there." He said, "You'd like it up there." I did. And that's how I finished up at Scots College Warwick in 1949. But when I appeared there in front of that class, and there were some well-known characters on the Darling Downs these days that were in that class. There was a Greg Struts from out there. And there was a Tom Speed. And so we go on. I think 3 or 4 of them have died since then. I look back, it's quite sad that there was a John Cooper that came from this area out over here, Couper, and there were a number of fellows. A fellow named Dearden. Dearden's have been well known. He turned out to be a university lecturer of all things, but in physics. And I've had his relatives at BBC since. But that group, when I walked into that class, I had not the faintest idea what I was going to do, how I was going to teach. I simply probably just copied the manner in which I had been taught by our teachers at Toowoomba Grammar. And that's how we carried on. I didn't do any formal training for teaching until I did a dip ed from New England at about 10 years later. By that stage, they were becoming more interested in you equipping yourself to be a registered teacher. I mean, the people that got into teaching Most were very fine fellows, but we always had the odd con man or two. And I got some very funny stories which I won't engage in. Now, fellows who were actual con men. One in Sydney who got away with £400 from the school at Newington College in the days when £400 was a lot of money. He organised a concert at the in Sydney, and then when he collected all the funds, he disappeared. And he was actually apprehended, trying to go on board ship to get away because he owed so much money to farmers and David Jones as well. I heard later that he was still operating in King's Cross, where many years later. But generally speaking, the type of man that came into teaching at that stage, they were committed. It wasn't so much what we said or how we did it, it's what we were, probably. We were enthusiastic. I can think so many. It was a period in our history when you had an assured place. The future wasn't so uncertain. The war was over, and we were building a new country here, really. We were starting to expand. It was thrilling experience. Teaching in itself was expanding very rapidly. I'll say a little bit more about that, hopefully, if I have the time, before I finish. But we were enthusiastic, and there was a will to perform to the best of our abilities. I look back nostalgically, and think the days of the external exams were something that in some ways, I'd like to return to. I know it's impossible. The days when we used to sit beside our pupils and we'd coach them and tutor them, we'd push them, we'd do everything possible to get them through this exam, the junior or the senior. These days, they are fighting against us. Every time you hand back a piece of work for which you're assessing the results, they come and indulge in what I call horse trading. They try to batter you into giving them more marks. And you say, but that's the way it is. But, sir, and it's a most unpleasant experience to be seen as the one that's failing them. It's no longer that unknown examiner down in Brisbane who used to prepare the senior or the junior exam that was failing them. We are seen as the ones that are actually teaching them and marking them, that are assessing. We're the ones that are responsible for their failures. I sat beside a boy yesterday who was almost in tears when I handed back a piece of work to him, which he'd done badly. He said, "I spent so much time. He's year 12. I said, "I know you did, but you didn't produce any work that was any real evidence of that." And I knew this boy, really his performance over the last 18 months, he hasn't a possibility of ever getting what you'd call a pass mark at all. I said, "Have you been offered any other work in the last few months?" Yes, he said, "My father's managed to get me an electrician's apprenticeship." I said, "Well, take it. Take it now. Don't stay on at school any longer." There are so many of them that are staying on at school in the hope that something may eventuate at the end of year 12. But back to Scots College, I must say something about Scots College because it's dear to the heart of Sir Alan here particularly. The year that I took up my appointment there, the headmaster was aged 28. It was Des Davey. The senior master was aged 29, Colin Estwick. Housemaster of De Conley House was a well-known identity in this area. That was Henry Joppick, aged 21. He later became the mayor of Warwick and mine host of the Horse and Jockey Inn at one stage in Warwick. But Happy Joppick was 21 years of age in charge of De Conley House. And the fellow that was in charge of schoolhouse was me. The name of L.P. Trudinger. He appeared a month ago. I hadn't seen him for 33 years. He appeared back in Brisbane to actually participate in his son's wedding. He's been professor of music at Winnipeg University in Canada and professor of New Testament. He's a reverend doctor, and he came back to officiate at his son's wedding. His son is now doing his doctorate at Queensland University, of all places. He was in charge, aged 21, of schoolhouse. I was his deputy because I hadn't had any teaching experience. He had taught for 12 months, I think it was, before he came to Scots Warwick. Even Ray Teskey, in charge of the Kingswood, was 29 years of age. But boy, what a group they were. What an enthusiastic group. And the memories that I have of Scots College, and forgive me for bringing these back, but in my first few months, I remember when I woke up one morning, there was a noise coming from the dormitory, from the schoolhouse dormitory one day. I said, "Something wrong." There was loud talking. So I put my dressing gown on, as we did in those days, so we wouldn't appear formally in the dormitory in front of the boys. I found two fellows sitting up in bed, and one of them had what turned out to be a bottle of hospital brandy, And they'd been sharing this brandy for apparently the previous hour or so, and by the time I had reached them, they were both quite well and truly under, and they were making such a noise. Apparently he picked up this bottle of hospital brandy over at one of the local hotels. I don't know how it wangled it out of the licensee or the bartender, but he did. About 20 minutes later, after I took it from them, so we'll attend to this in the morning, I heard a rush towards the bathroom, and lo and behold, both of them, these poor wretches by this stage, were violently ill in the bathroom. In the toilet, I stood behind them and said, "Sir, be your arm well right," and that had not the slightest bit of compassion for these poor wretches. The same fellows, I think, Scots College in those days, they insisted on cold showers. Boys had to get out of bed, have cold showers winter and summer, and Warwick in the winter. And then they'd go outside and engage in sort of aerobics or gymnastics outside on the lawn. The frost would be brittle. And then
You just run through the shower.
that's right. And I remember one boy running through the shower, and his anxiety to get through slipped over, poor wretch, and skidded right along. I've never forgotten that. We used to then finish supervising them and go into the bathroom at the end, which was the master's bathroom, and have our hot showers. I can recall my friend was having a hot shower at the time I was supervising. There was steam was coming out through the bathroom, through the door. And the boy said, "Look, sir, the place is on fire." Enough said. But, and I think of the sort of another experience that comes to mind that reminds me of the type of boy we had. I remember supervising the prep school Kingswood, which had aged up to grade 5. And these two boys, John Ewan and Robert Park. Robert Park always had a sallow complexion, prickly face, dark. John Ewan was a much darker skin and didn't show it so much, but both of them over a period of 10 days or so began to assume a sickly, greeny, grey sort of an appearance. And we were watching these boys getting progressively worse. We say, "Anything wrong with you fellows?" "No, just not at all." And couldn't understand what was going on. I was coaching tennis one afternoon on the school tennis courts and watching the boys, and I noticed these two drift up past the school and out towards the back, up towards the old Yangon railway line, which was just to run at the back of Scots College. So I decided to follow them, and I crept up behind the school building. They'd disappeared. I went over the top, and they'd disappeared also behind the raised railway line. So I crept up, and I could hear voices over the other side in a culvert. I peered over the top, and here they were, both of them with great big pipes. And there they were, and the stench that was coming from those pipes, they were smoking plug tobacco. And they'd been smoking this for about a fortnight prior to this. They'd been stealing this from old Bertrand de Conley. The grandfather of John Ewan was Bertrand de Conley, and they used to go there at weekends, and they'd been stealing his grandfather's plug tobacco. There they were. These same boys, I remember in an inspection of the dormitory, I remember seeing a suitcase sticking out from beneath a bed. On Sunday mornings, they have to be dressed in their suits, and they get their boaters on. Off they'd march to church. They'd have to march right in, crocodile. I look back now and I cannot believe it, but there they were on a hot summer's day. They'd have to march from Scots College and right into St Andrews in Warwick itself. No matter how hot the day was, they still wore their coats. However, before this, we used to have an inspection of the dormitories. I saw this suitcase sticking out, and I gave it a kick. I said, "What on earth is this doing here?" And as I kicked it, I needed my knee, and it came back. It was so heavy, and there was a clank. "What on earth we got in there?" And I said, "What on earth you got in here?" "Oh, get it out. Let's have a look." And they took it out, and there, I didn't understand what they were. They looked great pieces of metal with great teeth. One was a rabbit trap. The other one was a dingo trap. And I said, "What on earth are you doing with this here?" "Well, sir," they said, "we figured we might catch a few possums." I said, "But you don't need a dingo trap to catch possums, do you?" And they said, "No, sir." They said, "We thought that we might be useful for masters what walk in the night." Thereafter, to make one look at those savage things, I always entered that dormitory very carefully, and thereafter, needless to say, that went home at the next weekend. They had a boarders' weekend. But those kids, I think, They were good country lads, but they were so resourceful. Oh, I could carry on. I could talk for so long. Got to keep looking at this watch. What time is getting on here? Oh, about another 7. Yeah. But Toowoomba Grammar was a place which was different. There were a lot more day boys at Toowoomba Grammar. They were more urbane in some respects. Not quite so different some ways, but what I recall of Toowoomba Grammar my first year was Toowoomba Grammar had amongst their first years the most efficient and effective shoplifting gang that we've ever had to do with over all the years I've been teaching. They had accumulated in the ceiling of the old dormitory, the main dormitory, enough material which was mainly electrical. There were toasters and all sorts of things they had actually shoplifted, and it was a challenge to be able to bring home. The bigger the thing you could bring home, the greater esteem you had with your peers. And these tits had accumulated, I suppose, it'd be hundreds of pounds worth of material in the dormitory, and the police actually came in on this one. But I remember Beach Mills, who was the headmaster at that stage, had a very suitable punishment. He decided the police weren't going to do anything about it. They didn't proceed against them. But for the next term, these about 18 to 20 boys involved in this, they did gardening all of Saturday morning under his supervision. I think it was for 3 months. Every Saturday morning, these kids did penal servitude and gardening. As a matter of fact, one of Toowoomba's well-known solicitors, name was actually the organiser of that particular game. But that's well equipped. Arthur will know him. We learn as we go along. Actually, at Ascombe in Sydney, not long after, Ascombe is Sydney's most exclusive girls' school. There was a shoplifting gang that would have put that group in, left them for dead, because at Ascombe, the girls were challenged to steal frocks from the boutiques of Double Bay, worth a certain amount. They weren't accepted into this particular inner group unless they had stolen a dress which was worth more than what these days, maybe $1,000 or even more. What's $1,000 I hear of some of the dresses women buy? But they had to buy something of that equivalent, steal something of equivalent. And actually, some of them even walked out in them from these stores. They managed to do it with such aplomb. Probably equipped them very well to be married to some of our corporate chiefs in later years. Nevertheless, shoplifting was something that was always a problem. We don't seem to have the same, maybe it's just not enough challenge, it's just too easy these days, but businessmen will know more about that. You fellas would know. However, I was encouraged after 3 years of grammar to go to Adelaide. That was quite an experience too, to teach in Adelaide, which in those days was almost cut off from the eastern states. There were no bitumen roads in the early 50s, between Adelaide and Melbourne and Adelaide and Sydney. There was a great length of gravel road between Bordertown and Murray Bridge, which wasn't bitumen until well into the 50s. And even on, they say you had to take along metal strips occasionally when the sand was blown across. It was before the days of the 90-mile desert scheme, which was so successful in later years in turning the desert into really good pastoral. The AMP conducted that experiment, but we were cut off seemingly. When we went to Adelaide, it was almost not as bad as going to Western Australia, but there was very little movement between the states, as I recall. When I came back from Adelaide to Brisbane or Toowoomba on holidays, you just didn't see any South Australian cars on the road. If you did, you just about turned yourself inside out and acknowledging who they were. I remember how far it was to Perth. Some of you may have crossed the Nullarbor in the days before it was bitumen. But I well recall a friend of mine whose father was transferred as the state manager of the National Bank from Perth to Adelaide. He decided to drive across his new Humber Super Snipe. This was 1953, and this new Humber Super Snipe staggered into Norseman, as I recall, with a broken front suspension. In the days when you could not see the holes in the road, they were filled with bull dust, and it hit one too many ruts. While they were waiting there to be repaired, another Humber Super Snipe came in, and Larbar was driven by the author Neville Shute, who was out at that period collecting material for his novel A Town Like Alice. Life in South Australia was different, there's no doubt about it at that stage. They still referred to people over here as foreigners. And I recall when Painter and Dixon, who are a well-known contracting firm, but you would know their name they tendered for a new building at King's where I was teaching, and one of the council members said, even though their tendered price was lower than the South Australian, they were not going to have any foreigners coming over there to build their new building in Adelaide. Those parochial attitudes were very, very strong. It was different. You even wore different clothes. It was so wet in winter, of course, I'd never experienced weather like that, the wet winter. And it even had an earthquake. I remember I lived through this earthquake, which was an extraordinary experience. To wake up at 20 to 4 in the morning, be rocking around in your room and see everything vibrating. And I called out when it all settled down. There was a deathly hush before the hubbub started. And one of the other masters who'd been there for years, who knew South Australia well, I said, "You have these round here very often." Well, that's how he reported me in his memoirs, which he only published about 3 or 4 years ago, as having said. And to which he very laconically replied, probably about once every 50 years. Now, I said, "Well, I don't think I'll hang around for the next one." It was an extraordinary experience, but it was a private school, as all private schools were. They were small in those days. There was a strong sense of community, firm friendships you established with the boys and their parents. You were invited to their homes. You were very heavily committed to the life of the school. I'm going to find too long, I'll just cut this off. But particularly was this heavy commitment. I look at back and you'd understand what it was all about. I used to coach tennis from 7:30 to 8:30 every morning of the week, individually. I got a small remuneration for that from each boy. It was a form of private coaching, semi-professional. Then I coached the first tennis team Mondays and Wednesday afternoons for 2 hours, the first 11 on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 3:30 till 5:30. Friday afternoon I used to coach the